Today is May 28th, 2024, and my guest is author Cynthia Haven of Stanford University. She is a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar. Among other books, she is the author of Evolution of Desire, A Life of Rene Girard, which was the first biography of the French theorist published in 2018, and she is the editor of Rene Girard's All Desire is a Desire for Being Essential Writings, which was published in 2023. Cynthia, welcome to EconTalk.
Pleasure to be here.
Our topic for today is René Girard and his ideas. We have a previous episode on Girard with Jonathan B. that we'll link to, but I want to start with a bit about Girard's life. He was born in 1923. He died in 2015. What was his career? Where was he? What was he writing about? He's not a normal scholar with a narrow discipline, and he had a very unusual academic life.
Yes, he began in Avignon, where he was born. Went to the École des Chartes. He followed in his father's footsteps. His father had been the curator of the Palais des Papes. After the war, he was mostly in the École during the war. He went to Paris, came back to Avignon, helped launch the first Avignon Festival, which is now a major event in Europe. And then he went to America. It was a great time for young men to be, America was looking for more European young men to supplement their colleges and their universities. And he took the opportunity and went to Indiana, which is how he began his American career.
And he ends up at Stanford. When did he arrive at Stanford?
He didn't arrive till Stanford till 1980. He went to Johns Hopkins, went briefly to Duke and Bryn Mawr, went to the Buffalo, was at the university there, went back to Johns Hopkins, and then went to Stanford. And Stanford is where he spent more time than any place else in his life.
And if you had to pigeonhole him, what discipline would you say he's in? What did he study? And what did he write about?
He kind of crossed boundaries, didn't he? He was technically, his PhD was in history. He did American and French opinion during the war and after the war. He did the history of Avignon, I think, in the 14th, 15th centuries for the École des Chartes. But something began to simmer in him in Indiana, and he began already thinking about what had happened with the war, what had happened with the bombing of Hiroshima. And that kind of changed his direction. He was very influenced by Malraux. He was also very influenced because in his one of his early classes, he had a roll call. I love this little story. And he came across a name he couldn't pronounce, and the name was Martha McCullough. So for a Frenchman, a name that ends with O-U-G-H was unpronounceable. And he solved the problem a few years later by marrying her. They were married for more than 60 years. It was a very happy marriage, a very contented marriage.
Beautiful. So the central ideas, he writes about lots and lots of different things. He's in this book that we'll be referring to his collected essays that you edited recently. All Desire is a Desire for Being. Let's start with the title, which is in the back of the book. I really like it. You have a bunch of aphorisms. We may refer to a few others of Girard, but one of them is the title, All Desire is a Desire for Being. What did he mean by that?
Well, I'm so proud of that because that was my discovery. There was a book of Q&A interviews with him. Excellent. I highly recommend it. When These Things Begin, his interviews with Michel Drucker. And I was looking it over when I was working one of my earlier books about him. And that phrase just jumped out at me from the page. And I wondered, nobody had noticed it before. And it really takes the whole mimetic cycle that he developed one step earlier. He always says at the begins with envy. It begins with but the envy itself is beginning because we actually long to be someone else. We don't want to just imitate them. We want to occupy them. We want to be them. And that is why all desire is a desire for being. We crave something other than we are. Obviously, that can be a good thing. We can become better, but it also puts us in competition with other people. Hence the problem.
We'll talk about that in some length. But the central idea of that, you use the word mimetic. The concept that's associated with Girard in this area is mimesis, which I loosely translate as imitation. But as you point out, it's more than that. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on what Girard meant by mimesis?
We are imitative beings. Imitation is how it drives us forward. It is. We begin imitating as soon as almost seconds after we're out of the womb. It's why we learn. It's how we learn, but it's also how we come to fight with each other, because we'll both reach for the same things, whether it's a job, whether it's an office suite, or a fancy car. We long to be something other than we are.
And I think when I interviewed Jonathan B., I'm sure I revealed I had not come across Girard's ideas until, literally a year or so, a few years ago at most. And when at first glance, there's something very appealing about the theory as a descriptive theory. I've mentioned my granddaughter. I've had the privilege of watching most of her first 2 years of life at close range. And one of my favorite examples that I think I've mentioned before is she's learned how to walk, and she's holding a milk carton, and she's got the lid, the top of the milk carton in one hand and the carton itself in the other. It's empty. And she's walking around the room as if she has won an Olympic gold medal or cured cancer because she is imitating the adults who walk around occasionally with a milk carton to make coffee. Her language is all imitation. She will repeat endlessly things you say. She repeats things in English, in Hebrew. I could teach her French. I could teach her any language I want. She wouldn't understand a lot of it, but I watch as she continually imitates. Over time, she starts to have conceptual understanding of things. And it's a remarkable aspect of the human experience. But I think we like to believe that after we get to a certain age, that ends and we create ourselves. There's a certain date at which we're done with all that, and now we have a blank slate with a bunch of capabilities, and we write on it our own desires, and of course, we are our own person.
We're kidding ourselves.
We're kidding ourselves. So, and yet, this idea that we're kidding ourselves makes, I think, many of us hearing this idea uncomfortable. Is there any room, which is good, nothing bad about that, is there room for authenticity? Is there any, if my desire is to constantly be something I'm not, someone I admire, someone I aspire to, as you say, it can be a good thing. But if I'm always aspiring to escape my own self, what's left of me? What's authentic about me in that story?
I don't know how anything could be completely authentic, because it's got to come from somewhere. I think that's one of the three major things that Rene did. Is he upset at the nature of our desire and our violence. First, that our desire is authentic in our own. Second, that we fight from our differences rather than our sameness, which is also caused by this mimesis. And, he also made an argument that religion is not the cause of violence, but rather the way in the archaic world, our solution for controlling violence. But we're going to see a lot of mimesis this year because it's an election year, which always brings a lot of conflict, and everybody will be pressured to think like everybody else.
So explain this role of conflict. the book of essays opens actually with a very short essay on conflict that basically says it's the essence of the human experience that we have conflict. We may fool ourselves into thinking it's caused by something external, like say religious differences, but he says no, it's rooted in our being. And I'm confused why imitation has to lead to conflict. So if we have someone, let's take a positive view. If I have someone I admire, someone who I respect, and I want to put on their identity, I prefer it to the way I feel about myself. And I start imitating what they do, what they like, what they say, how they say it. And of course, just to go back to the parenting, grandparenting, child thing, it's very eerie when you see children as adults looking more and more like their parents, not physically, but in their gestures, in their desires. And you can see it in yourself, sometimes in the mirror, sometimes you feel it in your heart, and you realize, oh my gosh, I'm becoming my father, or I'm becoming my mother. But why should my, say, love, or not love's not the right word, my envy or desire to be someone I'm not, whether it's an athlete, a neighbor, or a pop star, why should that lead to conflict? Shouldn't that be kind of a harmonious thing?
No, ultimately, I think we notice that somebody else is copying us or imitating us, and it creates irritation. Because we think we're authentic in our own. But in fact, we're all the products of imitation. Like you say, you're imitating your father or your mother or someone. How could you not? But it creates conflict because the other person fights to keep themselves from appropriation, or what they may see as appropriation, or where they both become so much alike, which is what typically happens, the two people reach for the same thing. You see that in Shakespeare all the time. Two guys are so close together, they're swearing in Act One that they will be friends forever. And then a girl walks onto the scene. And they're so much alike that they both fall in love with the same girl. So instant conflict, because they both want the same girl.
Right. So it's
or a kingship.
Or your power.
Like Macbeth,
But it's not just then about, say, cultural transmission, which is clearly a powerful force in people's day-to-day lives, whether they are, again, aware of it or not. It also leads to much more complicated competition for power, women, men, fill in the blank. And that leads, in Girard's view, to much of, if not all of, what makes us at each other's throats. Is that true?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how you can quantify it that much, but we begin to be irritated by this guy that's jostling for our job, our girlfriend, our boyfriend. It creates a certain amount of social friction. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it does, but it doesn't mean I want to kill him. But
you just want them to back off.
So I guess,
or get your job, or
yeah, I guess there's two things here. There's conflict and violence. Let's go to violence. So, in this in your collection, you have an essay of Girard's on religion and violence, and there are a lot of religious wars throughout human history, and of course, many people blame religion for violence. Girard didn't. Why not, and how did he understand the role of religion in violence, which is a very powerful and provocative idea?
Well, he thought in archaic societies, religion was a way of controlling violence. When this tension happens, when people are fighting, the thing gets the obvious solution, or the frequent solution, is to find somebody that you can blame for your quarreling, somebody outside the situation that you can offload on him, and he can be sacked, demoted, dismissed, expelled and whatever, or maybe voluntarily go on his own. This is the scapegoating process. Now, in the 21st century, it doesn't often lead to violence, but you may not see that where you're sitting right now. At the tensions that can explode. We periodically find scapegoating. In the archaic society, this sacrifice of that person, the killing, the expelling, whatever, brought a tremendous sense of relief to the society because the problem's been solved. You got rid of this person. Of course, it's only temporary. And then the whole cycle starts again. Archaic, yes?
The idea of the scapegoat is in the Bible, literally, where the high priest in Jerusalem would put his hands on a physical goat and send them out into the wilderness and bear the iniquity of the people. It was a form of depending on your perspective, spiritual atonement, an embodiment of atonement, a spiritual inspiration. If you're superstitious, it could stand for something else. But that's one example in religious history. Most of us don't think of scapegoats as a common phenomenon in archaic societies. Just don't think about it. So give us some examples of what Girard is talking about and why it had a palliative impact.
Well, it has a palliative impact because there's this tremendous society that's been built up with tensions. We can go to Shakespeare again, Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and the Montagues. What solves that is the tragedy of the death of the two children of the respective families. Now, that's not I guess it's kind of sacrificial, and the society heals over that. It's not always as, well, you can hardly call that peaceful. But it's the offloading of a lot of social tensions onto a third party, which may be internal to the system or may be external to the system.
And certainly in primitive societies, human sacrifice was a practice that to mollify, the way I always thought about it is to mollify the deities. Why is it a therapeutic procedure for warring conflicting groups within that society?
Because there's a lot of tensions that build up, and it's a way of not taking it out on your own people, but taking it out on a third party that can be exiled, expelled, or killed. Look at a person who studies René Girard. James Allison wrote an excellent essay on the process after 9/11, 9/11, with a huge social relief and suddenly everybody feeling like they were one after this because they had gone through something together. That's one way that mechanism works, where there's this tremendous expelling of tensions in a society. And it brings a kind of healing for a while. But of course, nothing's really changed. So the same thing starts happening again, and you find another scapegoat.
And certainly here in Israel, before the attack of October 7th, there was an immense amount of divisive disagreement, protests, counter-protests over the question of judicial reform. In the aftermath of October 7th, there's a tremendous amount of unity. It's starting to splinter now as the war against Hamas has been continues and expands in the north. We're under attack in the north now from Hezbollah from the beginning of that period, and people are a little bit war weary and starting to disagree and fight over what we should be doing next. But I guess one way to think about the scapegoat then is when we have a common enemy, we do forget our squabbles. Mm-hmm. Or worse, things that divide us as a nation or as a tribe or as a community. And a scapegoat, a ritual scapegoat, is a way to create an enemy that would, in the case of Israel, we didn't create it. You can debate that. It's an interesting question. But it was imposed on us on October 7th, and we became more unified. But a lot of people would look at the United States right now, see how divided it is. And as you say, if there were another attack like a 9/11, there would at least be a temporary unification of some kind. How does Christianity fit into this in Girard's view?
Yeah, I was just about to go there. I haven't been able to refute this yet. It's an intriguing. Basically, Rene says that the permanent solution is forgiveness. And the people that invented forgiveness are the Jews. The scapegoat, it depends on you thinking the scapegoat is guilty. And the Christian revelation is the scapegoat is innocent. You can't kill the scapegoat unless you really believe he's the cause of all the problems. But that revelation, he says, the revelation of the innocence of the scapegoat begins in the Old Testament. I tried proving him wrong. I thought, no, it can't be that way. But in other religions, other ancient religions, you find debt forgiveness, but you don't actually find forgiveness. But with the psalmist saying, I'm being circled, I'm encircled, they're persecuting me. With Job, you start getting the idea that there's this innocent person being circled around by hostile people. And it's a note. And I think it finds its fullest expression in the Old Testament, in the story of Joseph. That is so incredible. There's nothing like that anywhere. With the forgiveness that Joseph offers, with the guilt of the brothers, with that moment when he's in the Pharaoh's hall and he's weeping so loudly that everybody in the court can hear the weeping of Joseph as he forgives his brothers who have been constantly the expiation of that huge generational conflict between Leah and Rachel, and the explanation of that with Benjamin being the last souvenir of that when they come to Egypt. It's a huge movement in the psychology and the spirituality of the human people. And there's nothing like it anywhere. So how do we deal with the fact that, we're picking on these people, but they're innocent? We're picking on them to make ourselves feel better. And the picking on them can just be harassing them if you're the boss, or it can lead to the kind of slaughter that we're seeing all over the world today. But what if the scapegoat really is innocent? Not necessarily innocent or a good guy, but not deserving of what we're trying to offload onto them. How do we work with that?
So I actually don't think Joseph forgives his brothers, but that's another. Most people do. Most people do. So, but let's put that to the side. We'll save that for another time. I agree that the attempted reconciliation of Joseph with his brothers, who definitely did him a dirty, sold him into slavery, probably almost killed him. What?
Repeatedly. But the most interesting figure, I think, in that story, who's often overlooked, is when they sell their brothers into slavery. Who is the guy that has the idea to monetize the deal?
Judah.
He is willing to enslave his brother, and they monetize it to do it. And then when they have that scene in Egypt, he throws himself on his knees and offers himself as a slave.
Yeah.
What a human reversal. I mean, what a human reversal.
That's one of the greatest. It's a cinematic moment that
it is an incredible moment.
Yeah.
It's an incredible moment. And the layers of it keep going down with the silver that suddenly they find on them, and the silver that they were trying to use to sell. They were selling Joseph for silver, and then in the scene they're finding the silver on the thing that's been planted because they're trying to test him. Suddenly they can't get rid of the silver that they were so eager to get earlier. The reversals, of course, the reversals are a big feature of the Old Testament. But
how does that, let's go back to Christianity. So I agree with you that the idea of forgiveness is in the Bible, in the Old Testament. I agree that, and I see that there's a power of that forgiveness, especially when you concede that the person you've been vilifying is an innocent. And in some sense, that's a different way to look at the Joseph story. It's not Joseph's fault that his father loves him more than the brothers. It's not Joseph's fault that his father loves his mother more than his stepbrother's mother. And yet he's the victim. And the fact that he crows over it, you could blame him for, but does he really deserve death or a lifetime of slavery? And the answer would be probably not. But how did Girard see the figure of Jesus and the crucifixion as a cultural form of scapegoating that improved things? Because I think he did, right?
Well, it's a more powerful recognition of the scapegoat's innocent. Father, forgive them; they know not what they do. But things begin to change. They begin to change in the Old Testament, but that's also, well, I mean, if you're Christian, you believe that Jesus is God, that it's a manifestation of God. So that definitely changes the scale of things.
But what is his role? What does Girard see as the role of Jesus as scapegoat?
Well, he was. I'm sorry, I had a thought that I was about to. Basically, well, here's an interesting idea. Rene said that the only way out of the circle of imitation. Now, Rene could overstate things. There might be other ways out, but certainly a powerful way out is the imitatio Christi. Because every other kind of imitation will lead you back into the human community, which is where things screw up. But imitatio Christi suddenly takes you out of that cycle of imitation. It's basically teaching you to imitate God in his forgiveness, if nothing, certainly that, but lots more than that.
And in theory, that should reduce conflict and violence. And so, right, he saw Christianity as a force for improving human relations. Would that be true?
I would think that he would think it's doing a lot more than that. That would be the minimum. But it's teaching us to be more godlike. If that's not presumptuous, it's teaching us to relinquish our hatreds, our enmities, our rivalries. So just a little phrase from Gore Vidal came through my mind. I'm going to paraphrase it. He said, every time I hear about a friend of mine winning an award or something, I get, you know this one?
Sure.
A little something in me dies inside.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, a little something in me dies inside. So how do we give up these rivalries? How do we give this up? And what you're talking about is an outscaling of it from one angle. I mean, it's taking us so beyond the level. But forgiveness as a form of reconciliation is the only way out of the cycle, is the only way to end the violence. In his book, The Scapegoat, his last sentence is, we must forgive one another while there is still time. If we wait too long, there will not be time enough. what did he mean by that? Um, I don't know. We can all take a stab at it, but that's the way the book ends. What is the process of forgiveness? What actually is the process? Because if we just kind of try to stuff it, it comes back in a more powerful form. And you're seeing that right now in the world around you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot about that, about what potential is there for forgiveness in the next 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. It may take a very long time. Both sides in this conflict that I'm sitting in the middle of are very aggrieved, and both have narratives that feed that feeling of being aggrieved. And, it's, I think about it a lot that, at least among educated people, we like to pretend that we should all be getting along, right? I mean, you're a nice person. I'm a nice person.
None of us is a very nice person, I'm afraid.
What?
I don't think any of us is a very nice person.
So that's one perspective.
We're nice people unless somebody steps on our toes.
Yeah, and I think, the way economists look at this is that it's nice to say things in the abstract, but when there's a zero-sum game or any kind of competition, incentives start to play a role in how I view you or you view me. There's a lot of cooperation in our economic systems. We work together to create things in companies, and so I think the dog-eat-dog nature of say capitalism, I think, is grossly misunderstood. But having said that, I think about a lot here in Israel. As I mentioned before, October 7th, people were very, very angry at each other, and during the war, there's been a song was written. I'll try to link to it. I don't remember the songwriter, but he says this really beautiful phrase. He says, paraphrasing, it shouldn't take our enemies to remind us we are angels. Because at the aftermath of this war, people have done extraordinary good things to help other people who are suffering. And why is it that has to be remembered in a war? Why can't you remember that in peacetime? Why is peacetime have its own internal conflicts, but when an external enemy is at your gate, or worse, inside your gates, you rise to the occasion? People did extraordinary things on October 7th and after to help their neighbors here. And yet when the war ends, it will be hard to remember that we're angels, that we're children of God, say, or just decent human beings who deserve to be treated with respect and be kind, because everyone's in a battle that's not a war, but an internal psychological battle. And that's just, I think, one of the great dilemmas and painful aspects of being a human being, that it's hard to be for us to be nice to each other, even when we're comfortable physically and have plenty to eat and a good roof over our heads. We still struggle. And I think in many ways, that's what Girard was saying.
Going back to Joseph, I mean, what happened in that room where he begins wailing and hugs his brothers? You go through certain things that outscale even the years that he'd been through and the stuff he'd been through and the slavery and all of that. Sometimes when there's something that huge, we can rise above it simply because the scale is so large, simply because there's no choice. But then we go back to, then it becomes Tuesday again. Well, that's the thing about forgiveness. We'd like to think it's once and for all. But we forgive one day and then the next day it's Tuesday again. And they're in our face. And we remember. How do you make it once and for all? I don't know. I don't have any answers for that. maybe that is part of what you were asking about. The Christian element of that is something happening that is that awful, that public. There's no choice but to outscale it. I don't know. I try to be better at it myself, and if I get the hang of it, I'll tell you.
Well, we're told in the Bible not to bear a grudge, but
good luck with that.
Yeah, good luck with that. And it's, coming back to your point about imitation and imitating God, in Jewish tradition, when the temple was destroyed, no scapegoat, the rabbis instituted the idea of Yom Kippur as a personal rather than a national experience where by atoning, by expressing an internal desire not to repeat the mistakes you've made in the past, you will be forgiven by God. And that holiday begins, the basis of that holiday is the idea that you will forgive others for what they have done to you. And the fundamental idea there, which, as you say, is almost impossible, is to put that grudge down. And yet, we all would like to believe, if you believe in God, if you don't, you can imagine this, I think, very easily. If you believe in God, you'd like God not to bear a grudge against you. I mean, after all.
Oh yeah.
You're only human. And even more powerfully, you were made by God, if you're a believer, with those urges and temptations and failings. And so it would seem cruel and unfair for God to bear a grudge against you and punish you relentlessly for things you did. And the idea that you can clean your slate with God through a movement of the heart, and of course by action as well, and at least in Judaism, the only religion I know a little bit about, is that you're asking God, don't bear a grudge against me. And of course, if you imitate God as you're encouraged to do, that means not bearing a grudge against others. It means not bearing a grudge against yourself. And it means treating people, giving them a chance to have a clean slate, at least if they ask for forgiveness. And shockingly difficult.
Do unto others as one would have done unto you.
I want to talk about a story you tell in the book, in your introduction. I think it's in the introduction. I'm going to read it. It's a paragraph. You write the following. Years ago at a Stanford conference, Girard faced a tough question about his unconventional methods. His research had involved a close reading of archaic texts, which is to say, stories. In them, he discerned hidden patterns of rivalry and the sacralization of violence and strife, an unending sequence throughout the long night of humanity. His writing was seasoned with characteristic humor and insight. He had learned something about himself along his journey, and so didn't offer himself as a hero or an answer. After the talk, one man asked a provocative question. Given that we can't entirely trust the veracity of ancient writings, how would you measure the success of your theory? Girard's answer was a thunderbolt in its directness and simplicity. You will see the success of my theories when you recognize yourself as a persecutor. What did he mean by that?
Goodness. Isn't it obvious?
Not to me. I don't know him as well as you did. And I certainly don't know his work as well as you do.
We're perps. I mean, we think of ourselves as the innocents, the people that are, put upon. But we don't have to think very hard. But for each one of us, I mean, I don't think it's presumptuous for me to assume I'm speaking for everyone. Each of us has been a perpetrator of injustices on a big or small scale, whether it's punishing your kid because you're mad at someone else at the office, or just turning away from people that need help, it goes on and on. We're all guilty of stuff. We're all guilty of bending the truth. We're all guilty of rewriting the story to favor our own innocence. But when you see that yourself, you're not that different, then it helps you forgive other people. Why should I get a free pass and they don't?
And of course, we see this in Adam Smith with the idea of the impartial spectator, someone who's watching you, who isn't you, who doesn't have your self-interest at heart, is just a disinterested, impartial observer of a spectator. And Smith argues that you can use that concept. He sometimes calls it the man within the breast, meaning your ability to sometimes step outside yourself and see yourself as you truly are. He talks about how difficult that is, of course, but that's what allows us to occasionally rise above our own narrow selfishness and do something kind or thoughtful for someone else. And also our desire to be seen as lovely, as he would put it, is partly what motivates us to do the right thing. But what I'm curious about for Girard is, first of all, it's easy to say we're flawed, we're imperfect, but persecutor is a much stronger claim. And I'm curious how that fits in with the rest of his ideas. Why did he see that as my ability to recognize myself as persecutor as a vindication of his own theories? He didn't just mean that, presumably he didn't just mean that we're flawed or we're sometimes inconsiderate or cruel. He saw that as fitting in with the mimesis and scapegoating, right?
Sure.
Can you explain that?
We're not disinterested people. We overlook so much. If we could see ourselves as others see us, what would they say? I mean, we exonerate ourselves daily. It wasn't so bad because I did it. Somebody else did the same thing. This is just so much in our human nature, self-love of the wrong kind. There's another story. I don't think it's in the introduction. It's often told. It's part of the Girard lore. He was in a room of theologians. I think it was somewhere out in Napa or something like that. And they were talking about the kind of world that we were talking about a few minutes ago, although different series of incidents. They were talking about the environment and this and wars. And they turned to Rene and they said, given all of this, what would you recommend we do? And he said, and I think it's a little bit shocking that it had to be said to theologians. He said, we might begin with personal sanctity. And really, doesn't it start there? I mean, if we begin to examine ourselves a little bit, the self-interest, how much more could I be doing than I am doing? How much do I excuse in myself what I wouldn't excuse in others? I mean, it goes on and on. How many grudges do I keep that are merely dormant because they happened long ago? Perhaps the people that they're held against are now dead. Why not begin there? Why not begin with house cleaning internally? So that's not quite the same as seeing oneself as a persecutor. But none of us is immune from charges of cruelty towards other people.
I took this, one of the maxims in the back of this book is the best way not to be crucified in the final analysis is to do as everyone else and join in the crucifixion. And I take that to be a statement about our temptation, both for groupthink and self-exoneration, to persecute others rather than deal with our own flaws. Is that a fair summary?
Well, he points the only way to not be stoned, is he said this elsewhere, is to join the stone throwers. And we do that all the time. I mean, verbally. And he points that out. I think there was one thing I was just reading about the other day. Herod and what am I? Herod and Pilate. After the crucifixion, I'm probably getting this passage mangled. They went home they made friends that day, or maybe it was Caiaphas, I can't remember, but they bonded over that. We bond by joining the persecutors. It's hard to be an orphan.
Yeah. Do you know what Girard thought of the Grand Inquisitor in the Brothers Karamazov? This idea that the church had betrayed the teaching of Jesus, and that the church as an institution had its own view of humanity that was not Jesus's view. Did he write about that? And did he talk about institutional religion versus personal religion?
I don't remember talking to him about that. I don't remember him writing about that. I think it gets back to what he said: we might begin with personal sanctity. And he seemed to practice what he preached in that regard. I mean, we always want to sort out the big international organizations before we sort out ourselves. We think it'll be easier, I guess, in my experience, trying to change deeply ingrained habits of hardness that accumulate over decades. You're not going to solve what's happening outside your office. It's on a much larger scale.
Well, there's an expression in the Talmud. It is not up to you to finish the work, neither are you free to desist from it.
Yes.
I'm not going to solve that, what's outside my window, the challenges of this neighborhood, this part of the world. But I do think I have a responsibility to try to do something maybe small, certainly for my own. I agree that I have to start with myself, but I also want to try to be a force in the right direction in this country and in any public work that I do, and I assume others would agree. I want to ask. There's a great line in the back in the aphorism section, which what.
I'm glad you like that section.
That was awesome. It says, Girard said, if you do not have a real religion, you end up with a more dreadful one. End of quote. And that's for me, a version of David Foster Wallace's "Everyone Worships." You're going to have a religion, so pick a good one. Don't pick a dreadful one.
Yes. And let's not make it politics this year.
Well, good luck with that.
There'll be a lot of stone throwers, take cover.
Yeah.
Yes. But of course, as soon as I compiled that section, you open a book and you see another great one that should have been in the book. He was very aphoristic. That was one of the fun things about being around him.
Why did you title your introduction? It's a very haunting title. We do not come in peace.
I crowdsourced that. And a Polish friend of mine, Artur Rossman, that was his idea. He's a very witty man, too. So that was his idea. again, it speaks to that assumption of our own innocence, because we feel we're basically good guys. We think we come in peace, but that's just not the case often. Everybody's a nice person until you scratch them a little.
One other aphorism, I mean, we've talked about it, but I think it bears repeating. Only the most superficial forms of imitation are voluntary. I'll say it again. Only the most superficial forms of imitation are voluntary. And I think one of the powerful aspects of this idea of mimesis is not just that we imitate, but we actually think we imitate because we are doing it voluntarily. And he's saying, don't fool yourself. I think that's really a deep idea.
It is. I'm sure I imitate my mother in 1,000 ways that I don't even see, because she was my mother. And I look like her. I'm bonded with her. And I'm sure that there's so many things I don't even see that I picked up. So many things intergenerationally, if you've noticed that one, from people you didn't even know that got passed through. Habits of thought, habits of being. Those are the ones that are not so voluntary because we don't even see them.
Let's close with a personal reflection. You write very beautifully at the end of your introduction the following. Speaking about Girard, quote, "We can experience him today through what he wrote, but the firsthand effect of the living, breathing man, his deep courtesy, his affability, his gentle humor and hard-won restraint is gone forever. I hope the section of maxims I have included captures the spirit of his offhand aperçu and transformative insights. However, I would trade them all to enter the Girard's living room on Frenchman's Road on the Stanford campus, with its rose-colored armchair from Avignon, its bookcases with clay ushabti from Egypt lined up on the shelves, and to have Rene again invite me to sit down beside him on the white couch and then ask me once more, what should we talk about today?" It's so beautiful. Just tell us something you might share about the man. I mean, that is obviously says it all, but maybe there's a little more you could add that would, about when you think about him as a person, not just as a thinker.
I miss him. I miss him a lot. His gentleness, not everyone experienced him that way. He was just a lovely, lovely person to be around. And he got better as he aged, I understand from people that knew him for many decades. I'm glad. It was just a remarkable opportunity to get to know him for, 7 years, 8 years. It was a pure gift.
My guest today has been Cynthia Haven. Cynthia, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. It's been a pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.